Hello, thank you very much for the opportunity to be part of this today. So, my name is Rasmus Nielsen. I'm a senior research associate of the Reuters Institute and also professor of communications at the University of Copenhagen. And what I want to do in the time I have with you today, and those who are joining us online, is to walk through a few key points I hope are useful in terms of thinking about AI in context when we think about what it might mean for news, the wider issue of public opinion around technology across sectors and society. And the central notion really is the idea here that public perception of AI use around news narrowly will be shaped by people's experience and preconceptions around media, but also by how they see and think about the use of AI across other sectors and society. So think of the similar way in which our expectations of and experience of using a news app are in part informed by experience of using other kinds of apps, search, social, government, private companies, and the like. And I think the same will apply to AI. So to deliver some points of how we might think about this, I want to draw on sort of a simple contextual model that I offered about a year ago at the invitation of the Open Society Foundations, and then two studies that I've been privileged to work with colleagues here at the Reuters Institute on that are both survey based in terms of how people use and think about AI in different sectors. So one that is looking at generative AI in the news specifically, and then a broader study that is around public perceptions of and use of different kinds of digital platforms, including generative AI, that was in the field in October last year. So we start with the ecosystem that we've collected data on. I think a sort of a simple way to think about this ecosystem and how it shapes public perception and orientation is to sort of start with the public as the sort of foundations of what we are interested in. These are the people as citizens, as consumers, as users, as readers, viewers, listeners, that everything else we're interested in here builds on. And then think about the different kinds of actors who compete for their attention, who wants to connect with them, who wants to influence them, who want to make money from us, members of the public, in these ways. And we can think, I think, in terms of sort of simple alliteration, as sort of three different kinds. We have obviously, yes, news publishers historically. We have platform companies that also compete in this space. And then we have this sort of incredibly heterogeneous group that I call promoters, so actors who engage in self-interested strategic communication, whether that is as a creator or an influencer who does so as part of a creative enterprise, but also as a way to make a living. It can be corporate communications, public relations, PR, marketing on behalf of organizations who make their money in other ways, but still engage in sort of promotional discourse. It can be political actors, whether elected officials, government, political parties, civil society organizations, labor unions, or others. All of these different kinds of actors compete for the attention of the public, for their support, and try to influence them, and in many cases also make money from the value that they seek to create for us. And I think this is part of the context for how people think about AI. And I think the data we've collected in the surveys last year can help illuminate how that is so. So the first point I would make is that while there is a lot of learned discourse about the shortcomings of the digital media environment, it's, I think, important to recognize empirically that much of the public navigates this environment on the basis of sort of cautious technology optimism combined with an element of what we've called platform ambivalence, where people recognize a series of problems, misinformation, harassment, problematic data collection practices, but at the same time also see digital platforms as having made their own lives better in many concrete, tangible, and appreciated ways. A very sort of simple top line question for this that we collected data on is just when we ask people whether particular kinds of platforms have made their own lives better, and with the follow-up question whether it has made society better on balance, we have, with the exception, and even that only partial exception of social media, for most of the different dominant kinds of digital platforms, much, much larger numbers of people who say that these platforms have made both their own personal lives better, but also society better. I think it's fair to say this is not exactly the way that these things are often discussed by academics and journalists, and people may be wrong about this, but it's still a social fact. that much of the public thinks about these things. And in a sense, the notion of sort of a techlash, if you will, if real at all, is probably primarily about a public response to social media and probably even particular social media companies, and less a reaction against the growth of the wider technology industry as a whole. The second point then is that if one thinks about the expectations and trust that members of the public have in the impact of AI, but also whether it'll be used responsibly by different sectors, including these platforms, but not only the platforms, also different other kinds of actors that citizens engage with, I think we can show that there is quite a sort of nuanced and varied picture in terms of how the public thinks about what AI will entail. So first we can start with the question of the magnitude of impact, what people expect in terms of how much they think generative AI will change different sectors of society in the coming years. When we asked this last year, you'll notice two things immediately. The first is that for a lot of different sectors that we ask about, you have, in most cases, a majority, and when not, a clear plurality of people who expect that AI will have a very or somewhat large impact on these different sectors. So quite high expectations in terms of what this actually will mean within a 5-year time horizon. But also, secondly, you'll notice that there is a lot of variation here, that there are definitely sectors, social media, search, but also science and the news media, healthcare to some extent, where much larger parts of the public expect to have a very or somewhat large impact within the foreseeable future. And then other sectors like ourselves as ordinary citizens, but also retail, for example, where there is a slightly less significant number of people who believe the impact will be large. If we then turn from public expectations around the impact of AI on different sectors, the question of whether people trust different sectors to use AI responsibly, we also have a very differentiated picture. The long and the short of it is that there is a very clear commonality across the countries that we cover, that healthcare and science are sectors in society where there is still very high and broad-based trust. There isn't a universal crisis of trust in our societies. There are many institutions that suffer from a crisis of trust, but not every institution, and not science in many cases, and often not health either. And then by country, things get a lot more sort of complicated, and I won't go sort of through the details here, because I think the more interesting thing perhaps is to provide the sort of the big picture of what it looks like if we map public expectations around the magnitude of the impact of AI against how many people fear that particular sectors will use AI, won't be using AI responsibly, that they sort of distrust sectors' use of generative AI. That can allow us to create a table like this, where you have sectors such as retail, where there is sort of a lower than average expectation around the magnitude of the impact. Not that much trust either, but it's not as consequential, if you will, if people are right about this. Then you have sectors such as politics, where again, there is a lower than average expectation in terms of the magnitude of the impact of generative AI, and then very high distrust. People are not expecting politicians to use generative AI responsibly in political parties. Then you have science and health as sectors where there is an expectation of a great magnitude of impact, but also combined with high public trust and a low number of people who believe that scientists and healthcare professionals will be using generative AI irresponsibly. And then finally, a sector, a quadrant of the figure, where the news media is in the company of social media, that from the point of view of much of the public are seen very similarly as sectors where there is an expectation of very significant impact and a very high percentage of people who do not trust these sectors to use generative AI responsibly. So what do we make of where this might be heading? I mean, I think at this stage, though this is really changing in many cases by the day, at least when we fielded these surveys last year, large parts of the public had limited personal experience of using generative AI. And at that stage, caution looms large for AI, both in terms of trust and in governance. And in that sense, there are some differences here, not only across sectors, but also in terms of how people at this stage see this technology compared to the more established platform technologies that people are more accustomed to and have more personal experience of and generally rate quite highly, with the partial exception of social media. So we take first the issue of trust. When we ask people about whether they would trust or distrust news or information about politics specifically, that they access via different kinds of platform technologies. The percentage across the countries we asked the question in last year that say they would trust this is generally quite low. People operate on the basis of what we in our work have called generalized skepticism. They're quite cautious about the integrity of all information they come across in the digital environment. And generally, there is what we have referred to as a trust gap, where people are skeptical of news and even more skeptical of news that they've accessed via different kinds of platforms, video networks, messaging applications, social media. And that seems to apply for news and information about politics found via generative AI as well. Search engines are a partial exception to this, though in other work we have found a trust gap for that as well. So this is sort of a single data point on that. This sort of lower level of trust, perhaps in part about lower personal experience, but perhaps also more grounded reservations, might help account for why, when we ask a question that we understand is a sort of a simplification of a complicated political reality, but I think nonetheless a useful one in terms of understanding public sentiment, about whether, on balance, platforms should have greater responsibility for policies and guidance when it comes to what content they allow, or whether national governments should have greater responsibility. Across the countries that we surveyed field these questions, there is, despite low trust, despite public recognition of many forms of problems associated with platforms, quite a significant openness to continued self-regulation, even as that clearly is not the political direction of travel in a number of countries. But interestingly, this is less so for generative AI as a newer technology, one that many expect to have quite significant impact on lots of different things, and one that lots of people expect many different sectors, social media definitely amongst them, but not only social media, also news media, for example, or politicians, to use irresponsibly. So in that area, there is a somewhat greater appetite for some form of national government responsibility, a greater national government responsibility. So what does this mean for news? I have just a few minutes left, so I'll just end with a couple of sort of summary points, if you will, from what I've tried to share with you today. The first is really just where I started, right? I mean, public expectations around, even assumptions about the use of AI are shaped by experiences across the ecosystem. And I think we need to sort of be prepared for a reality in which people will often assume AI has been used, irrespectively of whether it has or not. And in that sense, the sort of insistence on the importance of authenticity or artisanal creation and whatnot will only deliver a premium experience and a premium in value if people, in fact, find the product is premium, if they start pricing it in and assuming that AI is used by everyone for everything. Secondly, even though this is, I think, not always the way in which this is sort of discussed in the opinion pages of newspapers or among civil society or academics, I think we need to recognize that much of the public is cautiously optimistic about the impact of many of the platforms that dominate the ecosystem. Whether they are right or not is separate from that, for themselves personally and for society. And it's possible that greater personal experience of using generative AI may lead public opinion in a similar direction as use becomes more pervasive and more people acquire personal experience. We have in other work found that people who use these technologies tend to have a slightly more optimistic interpretation of what they can deliver. Third, public perception is quite nuanced and differentiated across sectors here. There are sectors, science, health, where people expect impact and trust that the sector will use these technologies responsibly. And then there are others where there may be expectations of high impact, but there is much, much less trust. Social media, news media, and politicians. So for news media specifically, I think here there is probably an opportunity to lean into the optimism and show that news media, at least individually, can make these tools work in line with their editorial values in ways that create value for the parts of the public that they aim to serve. But it's also clear that in a context of quite strong preconceptions about the perceived lack of trustworthiness of the news media as a whole, and many of the platforms, at least some of the platforms that people access news and information through, news organizations cannot assume very much when it comes to people's trust that they will in fact use these technologies responsibly, and they have to earn that trust and demonstrate their trustworthiness. With that, thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to the rest of the event.